Most people think loneliness is obvious. They imagine someone sitting alone, quiet, disconnected from the world. But the deepest loneliness rarely looks like that. In fact, some of the loneliest people you will ever meet appear perfectly fine on the outside. They smile, they work, they socialize, they move through life as if everything is normal. But inside, something very different is happening. Because when a woman has been lonely for a long time, her mind begins to adapt in subtle ways. The human brain is designed to survive emotional environments, even painful ones. Over time, it creates habits, defenses, and behaviors that protect the heart from further disappointment. And those behaviors reveal far more than words ever could. One of the first hidden signs appears in the way she handles connection. When a woman has gone a long time without feeling truly seen or emotionally supported, she often becomes extremely independent. On the surface, this independence can look powerful. She handles everything herself. She solves problems alone. She rarely asks for help. People around her may even admire her strength, but what they don't see is the reason that strength developed. It wasn't always her first choice. At some point in the past, asking for support probably led to disappointment. Maybe people ignored her needs. Maybe someone she trusted pulled away when she needed them the most. Maybe she slowly realized that depending on others only created pain, so her mind made a decision. If I don't expect anything from anyone, I can't be hurt. This kind of independence is not the same as healthy self-sufficiency. Healthy independence still allows space for connection, but the kind that forms from loneliness creates emotional distance even when she doesn't intend it. She may push herself to solve every problem alone. She may hesitate when someone offers help. She may downplay her struggles because she's used to carrying them quietly. To the outside world, she looks strong, but inside, she may simply be protecting herself from the possibility of being let down again. Psychologists sometimes describe this as emotional self-reliance developed through repeated unmet needs. The brain learns a lesson. Depending on people is risky. And once that belief forms, it subtly shapes future relationships. Another sign begins appearing in her communication patterns. When someone has been lonely for a long time, they often become extremely careful about what they reveal. They share stories, opinions, even humor, but when conversations start moving toward deeper emotions, something shifts. She may change the subject, she may laugh it off, she may minimize feelings that actually matter to her. Not because she's dishonest, but because vulnerability feels unfamiliar. Vulnerability requires trust, and trust becomes harder when someone has spent years learning to protect themselves emotionally. Think about it this way. Opening up emotionally is like handing someone the keys to a room inside your heart. If those keys have been misused before, the mind becomes cautious about handing them out again. So instead of opening the door fully, she keeps it slightly closed. People see a version of her, but rarely the whole story. And then there is another subtle pattern that loneliness creates, emotional patience that sometimes borders on over-tolerance. When someone has spent a long time without consistent emotional connection, their standards for attention can quietly shift. Small gestures suddenly feel extremely meaningful. A thoughtful message, a moment of genuine listening, a simple act of kindness. These moments feel powerful because they've been missing for so long. But this can also create a hidden risk. She may tolerate relationships that don't fully meet her emotional needs simply because part of her fears losing the little connection she has. This isn't weakness. It's the mind trying to preserve something it has lacked for years. Human beings are wired for connection. Our nervous systems literally function better when we feel emotionally supported by others. When that support disappears for long periods, the brain begins craving it in quiet, sometimes complicated ways. And yet, despite all these adaptations, there is usually one thing that remains unchanged: hope. Even the most independent, emotionally guarded woman still carries a quiet hope that one day someone will understand her fully. Someone will listen without judgment. Someone will stay consistent long enough to rebuild the trust that loneliness slowly eroded. The interesting thing about loneliness is that it rarely destroys the desire for connection. Instead, it hides it behind protective layers. Layers of independence, layers of caution, layers of emotional restraint. But if you know what to look for, those layers reveal themselves in small moments. A pause before answering personal questions. A tendency to solve problems alone even when help is offered. A quiet surprise when someone genuinely listens. These moments are subtle, but they speak volumes about what someone has experienced emotionally. And once you begin noticing them, you realize something important. Loneliness doesn't always show up as sadness. Sometimes it shows up as strength. Sometimes it shows up as distance, and sometimes it shows up as a woman who appears perfectly fine, while quietly carrying years of emotional silence inside her. But independence and emotional caution are only the beginning, because the second hidden sign reveals itself not in what she avoids, but in what she quietly longs for, even when she pretends she doesn't need it. Loneliness does something strange to the human heart. At first, it hurts. The silence feels heavy. The absence of emotional closeness is obvious, almost unbearable. But the longer it lasts, the more the mind begins to normalize it. What once felt painful slowly becomes familiar, and familiarity can be deceptive. Because when a woman has been lonely for a long time, she often stops expecting connection, even though deep inside, she still desires it more than ever. This creates the second hidden sign. She quietly craves meaningful attention, but she rarely asks for it. You may notice it in small moments. Someone shows genuine interest in her thoughts, and her response carries a subtle surprise. A conversation becomes emotionally real, and suddenly she becomes deeply engaged in a way that feels almost unexpected. It's as if a part of her wakes up that hasn't been used in a long time. Human beings are wired for emotional acknowledgement. When someone listens to us, understands us, and reflects our inner world back to us, the brain releases powerful chemicals associated with trust and connection. These experiences create warmth, calm, and emotional safety. But when those moments are absent for long periods, something interesting happens. The desire for connection doesn't disappear, it simply becomes quieter. Instead of openly seeking attention or emotional closeness, she may wait for it to happen naturally. She may tell herself she's fine being on her own. She may even convince herself she prefers independence. Yet when genuine attention appears, the reaction often reveals how much she has been missing it. You might notice her listening more carefully than most people do. She may remember details about conversations that others forget. She may ask thoughtful questions, almost as if she's trying to keep the moment of connection alive just a little longer. Because when meaningful attention becomes rare, the mind begins to treasure it. Psychologists often refer to this as emotional scarcity. When something essential is missing for a long time, the brain becomes highly sensitive to its presence. It notices small signals of connection that others might overlook. This is why someone who has been lonely for years may value a simple, sincere conversation far more deeply than someone surrounded by constant social interaction. But there is another side to this sensitivity. When attention feels rare, it can sometimes create hesitation. Even when she wants deeper connection, part of her may remain cautious. She may question whether the attention is genuine. She may wonder how long it will last. She may even pull back slightly when things begin feeling too emotionally close, not because she dislikes the connection, but because losing it again would hurt more than never having it at all. Loneliness often teaches the heart to expect temporary connections rather than lasting ones. So instead of diving fully into emotional openness, she may move carefully, observing whether the other person truly intends to stay present. You might see this in her communication patterns. She may respond warmly, yet hold back certain personal details. She may express appreciation, yet avoid becoming too emotionally invested too quickly. These small boundaries are rarely conscious strategies. They're protective instincts developed over time. The mind remembers emotional pain, and it quietly builds walls to prevent it from happening again. But behind those walls, the desire for real connection still exists. Another subtle behavior appears in how she reacts to kindness. When someone has been emotionally supported consistently throughout life, kindness feels normal. It's expected. It blends naturally into everyday relationships. But when kindness has been rare, the reaction can be different. A thoughtful gesture may catch her off guard. A sincere compliment may leave her briefly speechless. A moment of genuine understanding may feel surprisingly powerful. These reactions reveal something important. Emotional experiences that others take for granted can feel extraordinary to someone who has gone a long time without them. Loneliness amplifies appreciation, but it also amplifies caution, and that combination creates a unique emotional rhythm. Part of her moves toward connection. Another part quietly watches from a distance, making sure it's safe. This internal balance can sometimes confuse people around her. They may notice warmth one moment and emotional restraint the next, but both behaviors come from the same place: a heart that still hopes for connection, and a mind that remembers what it felt like to lose it. The fascinating thing about human psychology is that loneliness rarely eliminates emotional capacity. In many cases, it deepens it. Someone who has spent years navigating life alone often develops a heightened ability to observe others. They notice emotional shifts. They read subtle changes in tone and behavior. They become skilled at understanding feelings without needing them explained. Because when connection is limited, observation becomes a survival tool. This emotional awareness can make her incredibly empathetic toward others. She may listen deeply. She may offer thoughtful support. She may notice when someone else is struggling, even when they try to hide it. But sometimes the people who are best at understanding others are the ones who have spent the least time being understood themselves. And that quiet imbalance often reveals itself in unexpected ways, because the third hidden sign does not appear in her independence or in her desire for attention. It appears in the moments when someone finally gets close enough to see the emotional weight she has been carrying all along. There is a moment that often reveals the deepest truth about someone who has been lonely for a long time. It doesn't happen during casual conversations. It doesn't appear in everyday interactions. Most people never see it because it only shows itself when emotional walls begin to lower, and when it finally appears, it can be surprisingly powerful. The third hidden sign is this: when she finally feels emotionally safe, she opens up far more deeply than most people expect. At first, her personality might seem reserved. She may keep conversations light, balanced, even slightly guarded. People may assume she prefers distance or independence, but that assumption often disappears the moment she realizes someone is genuinely listening without judgment. When a woman who has been lonely for years finally senses emotional safety, something remarkable happens. The walls she spent so long building begin to soften. The quiet parts of her personality start to surface. And suddenly, there is depth, real depth. Stories she rarely shares, thoughts she usually keeps private, dreams that have been sitting quietly in the background of her life. Loneliness doesn't erase emotional richness. If anything, it amplifies it. When someone spends a long time navigating life without consistent emotional support, they often develop a deep inner world. They think more, they reflect more, they process experiences internally rather than expressing them outwardly. So when the opportunity finally appears to share that inner world with someone who truly listens, the release can feel almost overwhelming, not in a negative way, but in a way that surprises even her. You may notice that once the conversation reaches a certain level of trust, she begins speaking more freely than before. Her voice carries emotion, her thoughts become more detailed. She may even pause occasionally, realizing she is revealing things she hasn't spoken aloud in years. This is not a sign of emotional instability. It is the natural response of someone who has been holding experiences inside for a long time. Human beings are designed to share emotional weight. When we carry it alone, it accumulates quietly over the years. But when someone finally provides a safe space to release it, the mind often takes that opportunity. And for a woman who has been lonely, those moments can feel incredibly meaningful. But here is where the psychology becomes even more interesting. After opening up, she may suddenly become slightly cautious again, not because she regrets sharing, but because vulnerability can feel unfamiliar after years of emotional independence. The mind begins asking quiet questions. Did I say too much? Will they see me differently now? Was it safe to trust like that? These thoughts often appear automatically, especially when vulnerability has not been practiced frequently. It's like a muscle that hasn't been used in a long time. At first, the movement feels unfamiliar, But with time and consistent emotional safety, it becomes more natural again. This emotional rhythm is something many people misunderstand. They assume openness should be constant if someone truly trusts them. But trust rarely grows in a straight line. It moves forward, pauses, then moves forward again. For someone who has experienced long-term loneliness, that rhythm may be even more noticeable. One moment she shares something deeply personal. The next moment she becomes slightly quieter, observing how the other person responds. She is not testing intentionally. She is simply protecting a part of herself that has been vulnerable before. But there is another behavior that often appears alongside this deep emotional openness: a heightened sense of empathy. People who have spent years navigating emotional solitude often develop an extraordinary ability to understand others. They recognize sadness behind smiles. They sense tension in conversations that seem normal on the surface. Because they have spent so much time analyzing emotions internally, they become highly skilled at recognizing them externally. This is why many women who have experienced long periods of loneliness are incredibly supportive friends, partners, and listeners. They know what it feels like to be unheard, and they rarely want others to experience that same feeling. But sometimes, this empathy creates another hidden pattern. She may become the person who supports everyone else, while quietly keeping her own struggles private. Not because she doesn't want help, but because she has grown used to carrying things alone. And over time, that habit becomes part of her identity. People see her strength, they admire her understanding, they appreciate her ability to listen, but very few people ask what she might be carrying inside. And that is often the quiet reality behind long-term loneliness. The person who understands everyone else is rarely asked how they are truly feeling. Yet despite all these layers of independence, caution, and emotional depth, there is still one final sign that reveals the full story. It appears in the way she reacts to genuine, consistent care. Not dramatic gestures, not temporary attention, but simple, steady presence over time. Because when someone has spent years feeling emotionally alone, the smallest forms of consistent kindness can create the biggest emotional impact. There is one final sign that reveals more than anything else when a woman has been lonely for a long time. It doesn't appear in big dramatic moments. It doesn't show up in grand emotional confessions or obvious behavior. In fact, most people miss it completely because it hides inside the smallest details of human interaction. The fourth hidden sign is the way she reacts to consistent care. Not attention for a day, not a charming conversation that disappears the next week, but steady, reliable presence over time. Because when someone has spent years feeling emotionally alone, consistency becomes incredibly powerful. At first, she might not fully believe it. If someone checks in regularly, remembers small details about her life, or shows up with the same calm energy again and again, part of her mind will quietly observe it with caution. Loneliness teaches the brain to expect temporary connections. People appear, they show interest, and eventually they fade away. So when someone behaves differently, when they remain present in a steady, genuine way, it can feel unfamiliar at first. You might notice small reactions. She may seem slightly surprised when you remember something she mentioned days ago. She may pause for a moment when you ask how she's doing, as if she's not used to someone asking sincerely. She may even respond cautiously to kindness in the beginning, unsure whether it will last. But over time, something begins to shift. Consistency slowly lowers the emotional walls that loneliness built. Trust starts forming not from words, but from repeated actions. And when that happens, her personality may begin to change in subtle but beautiful ways. You might see her laugh more freely. You might notice her speaking more openly about her ideas, her memories, her dreams. You may see a lighter version of her emerge, the version that existed before loneliness taught her to protect herself. Because deep down, long-term loneliness does not remove someone's desire for connection. It only teaches them to guard it carefully. And when someone proves through steady presence that connection can actually be safe, the heart begins to reopen. Psychologists often describe this process as emotional reactivation. When a person experiences consistent positive interaction after a long period of isolation, the brain slowly relearns what healthy connection feels like. Stress levels decrease, trust hormones increase, Emotional expression becomes easier again. But what makes this transformation so powerful is how deeply it is felt. For someone who has lived with emotional distance for years, small acts of care can feel incredibly meaningful. A simple message asking how their day went, remembering something important to them, listening fully when they speak. These gestures may seem ordinary to most people, but to someone who has been lonely, they carry weight. They signal something the mind has been waiting for, sometimes for years: reliability. And reliability creates emotional safety. But here is something many people misunderstand. A woman who has been lonely for a long time may not immediately show how much these gestures matter to her. She might still maintain some independence. She might still keep parts of herself private, not because she doesn't appreciate the connection, but because rebuilding trust takes time. Loneliness builds walls slowly, and those walls rarely disappear overnight. Instead, they soften gradually. Every consistent action chips away at the fear that connection will disappear again. And eventually, something remarkable happens. The cautious independence that once protected her begins turning into genuine openness. The quiet strength she built during lonely years transforms into emotional depth within relationships. And the empathy she developed while navigating life alone becomes one of her greatest strengths when she finally feels understood. Because here's the truth, most people never realize about loneliness. It doesn't make someone less capable of love. In many cases, it makes them more capable of appreciating it. Someone who has experienced emotional distance understands the value of real connection in a way others may never fully grasp. They notice kindness more deeply. They respect consistency more strongly. They cherish moments of genuine understanding because they know how rare those moments can be. And that is why the quiet signs of long-term loneliness matter so much. They reveal not weakness, but resilience. They reveal a heart that has learned to survive emotional silence while still holding on to the hope that meaningful connection is possible. So the next time you meet someone who seems extremely independent, slightly cautious with emotions, yet deeply empathetic toward others, look closer. There may be a story behind that strength. A story of quiet resilience. A story of emotional patience. A story of someone who has learned to carry their world alone for far longer than they ever expected. And sometimes, the greatest gift you can give a person like that is something incredibly simple: consistency, listening, and the reassurance that connection doesn't have to disappear this time. Now I want to ask you something personal. Have you ever noticed these signs in someone you know, or maybe even in yourself? Tell me in the comments. Your experience might help someone else realize they're not the only one who has felt this way. And if this video helped you understand human connection a little deeper, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with a friend who might need to hear this message. Because sometimes the quiet truths about loneliness are the ones that help us reconnect with each other the most.